Alrighty guys, thank you everybody for joining. As you can see, today we're going to be talking about platypuses and SSIS and the intersection between platypuses and SSIS.
Yay!
Perry is coming up. Stay tuned. Stay tuned, Marcos. You will see Perry here in just a moment. So, as I was kind of mentioning there to Rachel, the reason why I wanted to know whether you guys had experience with both 2008 R2 and before, as well as 2012, is because Microsoft did a lot of work in the 2012 release of SSIS. So, a lot of the concepts and everything are going to be pretty much the same as far as what goes on in the control flow, what goes on in the data flow, and kind of the stuff that we're going to be discussing today. There is a good bit of overlap in there. However, there's also a ton of new stuff. So just because you've worked with 2008 doesn't mean you're going to pick up every single concept already in 2012, but it also doesn't mean you're going to be starting from scratch like you were kind of going from the DTS into the SSIS era. So today we're going to focus on 2012. Like I said, I'll point out some of the differences for you guys, especially in the deployment model, and we'll kind of talk through creating just an end-to-end package here real quick. And if you guys have any questions, by all means, feel free to toss those over into the into the question box there. If I don't have time to get to the questions today, I'm going to try to leave about 5 or 10 minutes here towards the end to answer questions for you guys. If I don't have time to get to them today, Rachel will give me all the questions, and I will make a list of them and put them up on my blog for you guys to be able to go out there and get the answers later on, because I do want to be able to get to all the questions for you guys. So without further ado, here we are, back to basics with the platypus. Just real quick, a little bit about myself. I work for Pragmatic Works here in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm a consultant and trainer here. I do some blogging. I work on a lot of SharePoint stuff. Recently, I've been doing more SharePoint than BI, actually. And I do a lot of speaking engagements, whether that's here online. I go to a lot of the SQL Saturdays in the Southeast region. I spoke at PASS last year, code camps, blah, blah, blah. Other random stuff. All right, so real quick, let's kind of give you guys an overview of what SSIS is, what it's going to do for you, and then we'll hop into the demo. So I've only got 1 or 2 slides here to kind of show you guys. I'd much rather be able to show you some demo and get you guys some hands-on with it, or show you guys the hands-on portion rather than just going through slide decks. So first of all, why do we even need SSIS? SSIS is an ETL tool. It's going to extract, transform, and load data. Essentially, it's used to move data around and do a lot of other things in the control flow, as we'll take a look at as well. But more often than not, you're going to be using SSIS to move data. So why we need ETL and why we use SSIS is because it's great for loading data warehouses and data marts. It's very, very fast to load a lot of those different kinds of systems. And you can also build in notifications and data cleansing. So quality data is a very, very important part of any project. And no matter how great you think your data is, no matter how clean you think your data is, as soon as you start doing any kind of a data warehousing project, you'll quickly be able to realize that your data is not nearly as clean as you thought it was. So SSIS is a great way to be able to do some of that data cleansing. Master data services is another way that you can keep track of your data, and Steve Wake actually did an MDS presentation on how to use master data services with SSIS a couple weeks ago. So if you guys are interested in using MDS and SSIS together, be sure to go out there and check that one out. It's out on our website. Okay, so why use SSIS? Why not just load everything with T-SQL? There's a lot of people that really just want to say, oh, I can bulk load that data, I can BCP it, or I can just move it between databases. Well, SSIS is really built to move data between servers and actually interface with a lot of different systems. So SSIS is really easy to hook into an Oracle system or a DB2, not just SQL Server. You can hook it into a whole range of different database options, as well as different kinds of flat files. So that might be a CSV, it might be a text file, it could be an Excel file. That the text files could be comma separated, it could be tab delimited, fixed width. It can handle a lot of different types of files, and it can handle them very, very easily. And it also tends to be a lot easier for people to use a GUI rather than code some of this stuff, and it can actually make debugging a little bit easier for you as well. So the real reason that we're going to use SSIS over coding sometimes is really because of the wide range that SSIS has as far as being able to pull in data from different sources and easily and quickly move data between servers. So rather than having to create a link server to move data around for your data warehouse, then what you might end up doing is just creating an SSIS package to do it. Okay, so some basic terminology here. On the right-hand side, the first term that we have is Perry the Platypus. Related to ETL, we have ETL, which we already mentioned was extract, transform, and load. The package is going to be pretty much the basic unit that we're building. So everything that you build, whether it's moving a bunch of data, sending some emails, moving data and sending emails, through FTP stuff, all that is contained inside of an SSIS package. All that really is a bunch of XML all compiled together. So I'll actually show you guys here in just a minute the code behind it. You're probably never going to look at the code, but it's something to keep in mind. Connection managers are going to be the way that we actually get to our data. So we always have to be able to connect to a SQL server or a flat file, wherever our data is located, we're going to get to it using a connection manager. Precedence constraints are something that we're going to talk about in the context of the control flow. And precedence constraints really control what happens in your package and when it happens. So if you need to truncate a table before you load it, you need some precedence constraints in there. You don't want to truncate, you don't want to load your table and then truncate it. That would be fairly counterproductive. Okay, event handlers, we're probably not going to get into be able to look at event handlers today, but I'll tell you guys what they are. I mentioned just a few minutes ago that notifications are something that, a couple slides ago said notifications were something that SSIS was useful for. Event handlers will actually allow you to build in some custom routines depending on what happens inside your package. So what I mean by that is if I have an error, maybe I want to write a record to a control table that says, here's the task that failed, this is the package it was in, this is the error message, and this was the time it happened. Maybe you want to send an email every time you have an error, so you can send emails inside of event handlers. There's a lot of different things you can do in there, whether it's when you have an error, when the package finishes, when it starts, when there's any warnings that come up, all kinds of different stuff. Okay. So getting started, we're going to show you real quick how to create a solution. We're going to show you some control flow basics, and then we're going to hop into the data flow. So the couple of things we're going to talk about here with the control flow, and then I promise we'll get right into the demo. So the control flow is very process-based. So the flow of your package is going to be determined as based on your precedence constraints and whether tasks complete successfully, whether they fail, or just whether they complete in general. We've got some options as to how the SSIS package flows at that point. The most granular unit of your control flow is going to be a task. So while we're going to be moving data inside of a data flow, the data flow is actually just a task inside of your SSIS package. An execute SQL task is another one that's going to allow you to execute SQL code against a database. So inside of our control flow, no data is actually moved. While you can actually bring back data inside of your execute SQL tasks, no data is actually moved inside of your databases at this point, unless you execute something like a store procedure. But then that's being executed on the database side, and it's not actually pulling it into the package and using any memory or anything like that. And finally, you can run tasks in either series or parallel. Okay, so let's hop over here to Data Tools. And this is the 2012 interface here. It starts out with Visual Studio 2010. If you remember before, in 2008 R2 and before, you were in the Visual Studio 2008 shell. Here we're in the Visual Studio 2010. Same concept as before. We're just going to create a new integration services project just like you would in your 2008 environment here. And we'll call this webinar. We'll say OK. And right off the bat, if you're used to the 2008 interface, you'll notice a couple of different things. You'll notice that down here we've got some getting started in SSIS. So there's actually some links that they built in, just some nice little helpful kind of getting started little demo environment or demo pieces here that you can go out and take a look at. They link to some MSDN articles. There's some downloads out there and everything for you. But the main thing that you're going to notice is before, you didn't have this little object called project.params. We also had shared connection managers before. We didn't have just regular connection managers. We did have SSIS packages, and then there was also one, I believe the data source view, I believe, was actually an option in the 2008 R2 version here as well. So a little bit different concept around the way that 2012 works versus 2008. In 2008, everything was done at the package level. In 2012, everything is based on the project. So in 2008, you would create a connection manager down here. I'll just create one here real quick for us. Localhost /SQL 2012. So I've got this in a separate instance, and we'll connect to our AdventureWorks database. So this would be the way that you would create a connection in the 2008 environment. You'll notice that it's just like it was before. Everything shows up with the default naming convention here, and it's available inside my package. When I create a new SSIS package here, you'll notice that that connection manager is not available. Again, just like it was in the worked in the 2008 version. With 2012 and this whole project deployment model, what we end up with is the ability to really share everything among all your packages. So that's what these connection managers here are going to do, as well as our project parameters. So parameters are a little bit different than variables, and I'll talk about that here in just one second. But anything that you see over here inside the Solution Explorer is going to be shared throughout the entire project. So if I create a connection manager up here by doing New Connection Manager, and I add, we'll create one to my AdventureWorks data warehouse, and I'll go with the DW this time. If I create that here, you'll notice that I get a second connection manager inside of this package, and then it has this little label on here saying project. And essentially what that means is that this is a project level connection manager. So this connection manager here now is available inside of every single one of my packages. So you'll notice if I come back over here to package 1, that same connection is also inside of there. So before we always had to go through and we had to create, if I wanted to, like for instance, load my data warehouse, every single package that I had to create, I had to come in here and say, I want to add this data warehouse connection. With the inclusion of these connection managers at the project level, we only have to create it once, and it's done from that point. Consequently, that also means you don't have to worry about configurations quite as much. So I don't have to go through all my packages and put package configurations on that connection. Once I set the value for this server name and database name here at the project level, that cascades down to every single one of my packages. So again, if you are familiar with that 2008 interface, I just mentioned the package, the configurations. You'll notice that something is missing here on this little list of options, and that is your package configurations. So in the 2012 environment, the package configurations have been removed, and we now use the combination of a parameter and project level connection managers to mimic that functionality. So for instance, if I wanted to change the name of my server name here, I would have to come over here, right-click, and say Parameterize, and then tell it that I wanted to override the server name. So rather than having my server name hard-coded in here, I'm going to create this new parameter called server name. And instead of localhost, I'm going to put my actual computer name in here. So fl-ws-conbs01. Okay. Notice I'm going to put this at the project level. And then once we do that, we have this little f of x icon on here. Essentially, all you're doing whenever you hit that parameterize button is you're having SSIS create an expression in the background. So much like you would do in 2008 and before, you can put expressions on things. We now have just an expression on here. Not sure why I'm getting that there. But we now just have an expression on here that's going to evaluate to the server name value. So we might end up doing another session another time to kind of go into the complete difference between how to do configurations in 2012 versus 2008 R2. That's a pretty large topic, but just know that the project or the package level configurations are no longer there. You do need to use a combination of connection managers, be that project or package, and then the use of your parameters. So something else that I can come over here and do, if you do want to upgrade to the 2012 version, but you want to be able to continue to use the original, the 2008 R2 and before version, you notice that I do, if I click on the project, I have this option here to convert to package deployment model. So if I click on that little button there, you'll notice that everything, I get a little warning from here. Let me get rid of this here. And let's see if I can get this converted over. Remove parameters. Oh, let me remove that parameter out of there. So I can actually, if I get rid of all the 2012 pieces in here, there we go, I can actually convert this back over to the original 2008 version. So you notice that my connection switches back over here to data sources, and if I open up one of these SSIS packages, you'll notice that I get that package configurations option back. So you do have the option to switch back and forth between the two. If you are going from a previous version, I notice there are some questions in here in the box about upgrading to 2012. If you open up one of your 2008 R2 packages or projects inside of here, and you right-click on here, you can convert those over to the project deployment model, and then it's going to run you through this little wizard here. Devin, I believe, actually has a webinar that is all about upgrading your SSIS packages over to the 2012 model. So be sure to go up there and take a look at that one if you guys have any further questions on how to upgrade your packages from one of the previous versions over here at 2012. So those are really the kind of main project level things that I wanted to talk to you guys about as far as the differences between 2008 and 2012. Now, just in general with your control flow, we'll go over some basics about that section of your package. I mentioned that there were all your data movement is going to happen inside this data flow, but you'll notice it's also over here in my list of tasks under the data flow task. So it is a task as well. And essentially what that's going to do, if I drag one of these over here, you'll notice my toolbox over here. When I click on this, it changes over, and I end up with a bunch of information in here that I'm going to use for moving data around. And we'll get to that portion here in just 1 minute. Okay, so you'll notice the interface here is just a little bit different than it was before. Before we had a whole list of tasks. Now they've kind of got these separated out into some commonly used ones. We've got all of our containers down here, and then we've got all the rest of the tasks that used to be in there before that you don't see already. So they haven't removed all the tasks out of here. They've just tossed everything that you wouldn't use nearly as much down into the other tasks section. So just to do some illustration here as far as how the control flow actually works here, what I'm going to do is drag over a couple of script tasks, and what we're going to do is we're going to run this package. So I'm going to rename these here real quick, just 1, 2, and 3, just to make it a little bit easier to refer to these for you. And I mentioned to you guys when we were going through that slide deck that your control flow can actually either run in series or in parallel. So you notice that I don't have anything connecting these. There's no way really for us to know that number 1 would run before number 2, or there's no naming that's going to force your packages or your tasks to run in a certain order. Moving these into a line doesn't make them run in a particular order or anything like that. If I run this package right now, what you're going to see happen very, very quickly, albeit, is that all of those run at the exact same time. They all turn green at the same time. Something else you'll notice here that's a little bit different is before the task would highlight. In 2012, you get these little check boxes. If there's a failure, you'll get an X, and you get a little yellow cogwheel that goes around if the task is currently running. So let's say that maybe I don't want to run all these in parallel. Maybe this is actually a truncate table, and this one here is a load data, and this one here is a notify of success. So maybe this one's going to send an email. Obviously, this would be your equivalent of your data flow. You know what? I want to be able to load. I want to be able to truncate my table, then load my data, and then notify somebody that all this data loaded properly. So these little green lines that whenever you click on one of the tasks, that you get the little arrow out of here, this little guy is called your precedence constraint. And that's really what controls the flow of your SSIS package. So if I run this package now, what's going to happen is this truncate table is going to run first, and then once that gets done running successfully, it's going to run my load data, and then once that gets done running successfully, it's going to notify somebody of the success. So hopefully the screen refreshes here fast enough for you guys to be able to see this. You'll notice that, that went way too fast, but take my word for it. These do run in order here. What we could do is replace this with an execute SQL task and just put a wait for delay in there and show you that they run in series. So maybe we don't want to notify somebody of success. We want to notify them of failure. So this right here is we only want this notify of failure to run if our load data does not complete successfully. Okay. If we double click on this little precedence constraint here, you can either double click on it or right click and do edit. You'll notice that I get a whole new screen in here that allows me to do some different options. So what I can do is say I want to keep this on a constraint. I've got some other options in here as well. I'll show you. So we can either do just a constraint, meaning success, failure, or completion. We can put an expression on there that says only go forward if the variable equals today's date. We can combine the two, or we can do an or situation. So we're just going to look at the regular constraint today. And instead of saying success, we want failure. So only when this load data fails am I going to notify somebody about it. So now when I run this, you'll notice that, get these windows out of the way here, you'll notice that the first two tasks run, but that third one does not run because this load data did not fail. So this precedence constraint here is telling it only go forward if there's a failure. What I can do here is force the execution. Forced execution value. Disable event handlers, fail package. I'm looking for something here, trust me. Force execution result. So I can kind of fake a data failure here. So now when I run this, what's going to happen is you'll notice that this task here obviously failed. You'll notice a little red X up here in the corner. And because that failed, it met the condition for this precedence constraint and then ran a task to notify somebody about the failure. So that's what your failure option there is going to do. The completion option is going to say it doesn't matter whether it succeeds or fails. As soon as that task gets done running, this load data task gets done running, I'm going to notify somebody of the failure. So it failed that time. If I come back over here and I switch that force execution value back over to success, and I run it again, you'll notice that I still notify somebody. So you just have to be careful as far as what you put on each of these precedence constraints. You can get pretty crazy with it, so we can add another precedence constraint in here, and we've got the option to do a logical or, and I'm going to run through this one here real quick for you guys, but we'll say that when we have the logical or, what this is saying is I only want to run this task here, my notify of failure, when this is successful or when this is a failure. When either one of those conditions is satisfied, I'm going to run my notify of failure. So if I switch this over here to fail, force execution results, and I run it, neither one of those two conditions are going to be satisfied because this task failed. It has to complete to go down this path. This task completed successfully, and it has to fail to go down this path. Since neither one of those were satisfied, this notify of failure is not going to run. If we switch this over, and you'll see only one of these two situations is satisfied, it still runs my notification because I have a logical OR situation here. So you can get very complex with the way that your precedence constraints in here run. The most common one that you're probably going to use is more than likely going to be just the success, or you might end up with one of these failures out here just to do some notification. One of the kind of mistakes or kind of design mistakes that I feel is a design mistake that I see people make sometimes, and this is really something that carries over from DTS, is you'll have all these little failures out here. So you'll have a separate task out here that emails for failure, and failure of spelling things right. email in the case of a failure, and this is where those event handlers that I mentioned really come in handy, because rather than having to build this email for failure off of every single one of your tasks inside your package, you can just come out here into my event handler, and I can create an on-error event handler. So anytime one of those tasks fails, it would then execute the logic that's inside of this particular task here. Okay. So we don't really have a whole lot of time to go into too much more on the data or on the control flow. I do want to show you guys some of the data flow here real quick, but just to do a little bit of review here on our control flow. There's your animated versus a real platypus. That's Perry versus his actual counterpart. Go back. So, we took a look at what that basic unit of our SSIS package was the task. In that case, we were just illustrating some things with the script task. You notice that no matter what we ran in there, even though it was only one task, we didn't actually move any data. Like I said, you could actually execute some stuff with these execute SQL tasks here, but that's not actually going to be moving any data inside of our SSIS package. And then you guys saw how it worked both in series and in parallel for this, and then how those precedence constraints worked. Okay. So we're going to talk real quick about the data flow, and then I do want to leave a couple minutes to show you guys the deployment, because deployment is drastically different here in the 2012 environment. So the data flow we're going to be real basic with today. It's going to be streaming data. You'll notice in my little illustration that I've got over here from one of the 2008 packages that I've got data going through each one of the different sections of my package here. You can do multiple areas of data processing. So what I mean by that is you can split the data here. I've multicast my data into two separate groups, so I can do different sets of logic based on the same data. So your forms are a component, and then your destination is still just another component. And the data flow, as I mentioned, is also a task inside of our SSIS package. What's going to happen is, let's take the source, for instance. As your source executes, it's going to pass a portion of the data into a buffer, and it's going to pass that buffer of data between each one of these components. By default, that's going to be 10 megs or 10,000 records, whichever one comes first. Usually that's going to be your 10,000 records. So you'll notice approximately 10,000 rows move through each one of these sections at a time. So let's go over and take a look at our data flow. If I can get data tools back, there we go. So what I'm going to do is just drag over a data flow task, and what I have is a flat file out here on my computer, on my C drive, that's got some customer data inside of it. And this is one of the strengths of SSIS, again, is the fact that I can pull data from a variety of different locations. I don't have to pull it out of a SQL Server database. So I'm going to go through this section here pretty quick on how to set up this connection manager. Oops. Because this is very much the same, actually the exact same as setting it up in the 2008 environment. So hopefully most of you guys have seen this before. If not, there's a lot of blogs online that can walk you through setting up different kinds of files here. So this is going to be a text qualified. I do have some column names in the first row of data, and it looks like that fixes everything that I need here. So what I end up having in here, if you look at my flat files, I've got some trailing white space that we need to clean up, and there's also some other data quality issues inside of here that we're not going to discuss today, but just to illustrate some of the transforms that we can do, I'm going to show you guys how to clean up these trailing white spaces out of here. So I'll go ahead and say OK now that my data looks pretty good. Again, notice the little dots here indicating that the data, is continuing on outside of what I can see here inside this column. And then I've got the source and destination assistant. So I can actually run through a little wizard in order to set up my connections if I really need to inside of here. Or I can come down here to my other sources, which is the way that we're going to do it today. And we're going to take this flat file source and drag it out onto our design pane. So inside of here, again, just like it was in your 2008 environment, we're going to just select all the defaults here. And then I want to put this data out into an OLADB destination. So I want to write it to this AdventureWorks, connection manager that I've got created down here at the bottom. So I'll write this out to an OLADB destination. And one of the nice things about SSIS here, if you don't already have a table created, like I don't actually have a customer table inside of my database here, what you can do is click on New, and it'll actually pull in all the metadata from your control or from your data flow here and create the table script for you. What you ideally want to do is go in and modify the properties of the connection manager and change these from probably varchar 50 in the case of this corporate number to maybe an integer or a decimal. Address might need to be a little bit bigger than 50 characters, just a little bit of data validation kind of stuff like that needs to be done in here. So we'll call this table customers. And I'll go ahead and create that. And then go over to my mapping section and notice that everything is already mapped because it knows the names of the different files. Okay. The other thing I'm going to do here to cheat real quick, pay no attention to what I'm doing, as I am going to make a couple of modifications in hopes of this not actually failing, since I do have a couple of things in here that will fail. So now when I load this data, let me go over here to Management Studio and pull up that table we just loaded, or we're about to load rather. dbo.customers. We'll notice that there is no data inside the table currently. What I'm going to do is same as I would in 2008. I'm just going to right click and do execute package. And see which column I missed. No column delimiter for corporation name was found. That was not what I was expecting to see in there. Okay. Let's see what the other error message was here. This is why we build demos on the fly, so everybody can see all of our errors. Let me go over here to my file and take out this last row. I think it's just the last row that's causing us some problems here. Well, pull back up a notepad here as administrator. And we'll get this file cleaned up here real quick. So save it and let's try to run this one more time. If it doesn't work, I'll just switch out the table here in that source so we don't waste any more time on that. All right, so I obviously have an issue with my file there that I'm not going to sit here and troubleshoot while you guys watch me fumble around with that. So we'll just pull out a random table from over here, my Human Resources department, and I'll create a new just department table for it. We'll fix the metadata. This is one of the really nice screens. This is one of the really nice screens that they added in the 2012 version, so it's actually kind of worked out well. You'll notice that, or you'll remember before, if you ever had any metadata issues, that you ended up having to go through this really annoying screen to try to figure out what was wrong and fix all the data issues. If you ever changed the column name or if you ever changed the metadata on a column. The cool thing about this little screen is if I had any columns that were the same, normally you would see something like this. So I have a group name and a modified date, but it didn't, whenever I made the changes, my data didn't show up in in my new source. So what you can do is you can either check this option here to delete unmapped input columns, and it'll delete everything on both of these sides. Or what you can do is drag and drop these into the center section, and what this will do is say, anytime my data flow sees group name, it's going to replace it with the city column. So this is really helpful for being able to resolve some of those issues that you have whenever you change the metadata or whenever you change column name inside of your package. So for what we're going to do, we're just going to delete all the unmapped columns here, and then I'll come in and I'll just create us our department table here and get this stuff mapped. Okay. So now we just have those couple of columns there. And I'll switch this over to our webinar department table that I just made. And we'll go ahead and execute this package here. And you'll notice that 16 rows gets moved over here. And you'll notice that there's those 16 rows. We could go into a lot more detail on the data flow in general here. But due to time, we really don't have time to go into too much more on that. If you guys are interested in a little bit more just about ETL in general, we actually do have another webinar that's just an hour of nothing but data flow. So it's all about how the data flow works and all the different components that you can use inside of there, the kind of the pros and cons of some of those different ones as well. So those concepts in that webinar, they're all done in 2008 R2, but every one of those concepts transfers exactly as it is in that webinar over to the 2012 version. The task names are all the same. I believe in that one we do some lookups, we do some conditional splits, and then we even talk about some of these really bad transforms like your sorts and your aggregate transforms and a bunch of those different kinds of things. So the webinar, I believe, is called Introduction to ETL. That's the one that will show you all the different stuff inside of your data flow here. So in these last couple minutes here, we've only got a few minutes before I want to start getting to some questions here, but I do want to show you the deployment model for these 2012 packages. So let me get rid of this extra package here, and I'll convert this back over to a project connection. So I mentioned before we can create these connection managers up here in the solution. We can also create them in the package and then convert them over to project connections if we would like to. If I can get rid of some special characters out of here. And of course I leave the period at the beginning of it. So when I do this, convert it to project connection, you notice it creates a connection manager there and switches that over to the project. You can also take the flat file connections and move those over to be project connection managers if you'd like. Pretty much any one of your connection managers there that you can use inside of your package here, you can create them at the project level, so I can actually consume that same flat file connection manager in all of my packages. That's not a very good name, so I'm going to rename this to customers _FF, so I know it's a flat file. And you'll notice it automatically renames that inside of my package here as well. All right. So deployment. Normally with SSIS, you're probably going to be deploying out to either the file system or to MSDB. Well, that whole thing has changed here inside of the 2012 environment. You'll notice if I go back over here to Management Studio that I have this section down here now called Integration Services Catalogs. And this is where all of your 2012 project deployment packages are going to be deployed to. There's no more option for deploying these out to the file system. You don't deploy them out to MSDB if they're in the package deployment model. They're always going to go here into this Integration Services Catalog section. So the first thing that I need to do is right-click on here and say Create Catalog. So if there's no SSIS catalog on there to begin with, you do have to create it. If you're familiar with reporting services at all, then you'll know that this is kind of an encryption key similar to the way that you do it in reporting services, how you have the RS encryption key here. This is very similar to that. SSIS DB is going to be the name of your SSIS catalog. It has to be SSIS DB. You can't change that name there, so that is not changeable. And you do need to enable the CLR integration. So once you check off that box there, enter your password, you'll be good to go. Just click OK. It's going to create my SSIS database, SSIS DB catalog out here. And you'll notice that it also, when I refresh this, notice that I don't have an SSIS catalog database inside of here. Now when I do refresh, my SSIS DB shows up. If we look at the tables inside of here, there's all kinds of different stuff. So we've got some things for parameters, which we obviously didn't have time to go into. Parameters are very similar to variables, except for the fact that you can't change the value of a parameter once the package starts running. Parameters are set at runtime, and much like your configurations were, and are only able to maintain that same value throughout the execution of the package. Variables do still exist, so you are able to still change the value of your variables when you run the package, but rather than doing that on parameters, you can't do that on the parameter section. So I notice there is a question in the box over there. Can we parameterize a connection based on the environment, like dev, QA, and prod? So part of what we're going to do here, let me show you kind of how I'm doing that on the current project that I'm on. There's a lot of different ways we can do that. So to deploy the SSIS packages, we're going to just right-click on there and say Deploy. We get a nifty little wizard. It's actually a very simple process to be able to deploy your SSIS packages out here. So give it the server name, and then we have to have a package path. You'll notice that I can't click OK. I can't just deploy it to the SSIS DB directory. I have to have a folder inside of here. So what I'll do is just create a folder in here called Webinar. And now that I have a folder, I can deploy it to that level. Can't deploy it to the SSIS DB, but you can deploy it to, you have to deploy it to a folder level. And then my project was also named Webinar, so that's why we get Webinar on the end of that. So that would be the SSIS DB, the folder, and then the project. Okay, I'll click Next and then do Deploy here. So what this is doing right now is taking all my SSIS packages, my connection managers, my parameters, and pushing those all out here to my server. So if I refresh this now, what you'll see is that folder that I created, and then inside of the folder I have all my different projects. So I can deploy multiple projects out to the same folder. So what I'm going to do here is I can right-click on this and say Configure. And what you'll end up with is a list of all your parameters. So there's a couple ways that we can do that parameterizing a connection between dev, QA, and prod. We can either put a parameter on it and then let that parameter control the server name by using an expression, like we did the parameterize option. Or the other way that you can do it is just come over here into connection managers, and you'll see the server name option here. If I just click on the little ellipsis here, I can actually change that value. So rather than it being localhost equal 2012, I can tell it to say FL-WS. So I can tell it to use the name of my computer rather than just localhost. So when I click OK there, you'll notice that the text turns over to bold so that you know that it has been changed. And then whenever I click OK, what that's going to do is it's going to apply that to every single package. So this is really the big advantage of using these project level connection managers is I only have to come in here and make this change in one place, and now every single package that uses that AdventureWorks connection is now going to be using this server name rather than localhost. So that's really the way that I'm currently doing it. I've found is a pretty easy way to be able to do this during deployments is you just deploy everything out to your next environment, and then you come in here and you make the change. The nice thing about doing the project level deployments like this is if I've already got my SSIS packages deployed out there, and I've already gone through and I've changed all of the server names over to be my QA environment instead of my dev environment, whenever I do the redeploy, it knows that I've already come in here and modified the server name, so it's actually going to keep my QA server name in here rather than override it again with my development server. You do want to come in here and check though and make sure that everything, so that any new connection managers get switched over to the new environment. But you do have the option to obviously keep the existing connection managers the way that they were. You can do the same thing if we had any project parameters in here. I could also come in here and click on the little ellipsis over here on the right side and modify the value of that as well. If you are interested in the environments, that's another way that you can tell it, where I'm at, whether it's dev, QA, or prod. There's another webinar that we had, the one that I mentioned that Devin had done about the new features in 2012 here. Some of that stuff is in the environments. He goes over the environments there. So once I have all this deployed out here, again, just a list of all my packages, you can do the kind of like I clicked on here and to configure and change everything at the project level. If I had any package level connection managers, I could always come in here and click configure, and I could change just the package level connection managers in here as well. So there's a lot of different levels of modification that you can make in here depending on what you would like to change in each one of your different environments. So the deployment is a very, very large change between the 2008 and the 2012 versions. It was one of those things that at first I didn't really care for the way that they had implemented it, but once I actually got to do this in a real-world environment, the package deployment model really seems like a lot more hassle now than doing it this way with the new project deployment. And I actually have come to like this quite a bit. So the other thing that's pretty nice about the 2012 version here is, we can come over here if we right-click and we there's this whole dashboard built into SSIS 2012 that will take and expose all your errors and your warnings and how long each one of your packages have been running right inside this little report. So some of those tables inside your SSIS DB that you saw in there were actually audit tables. So it has a bunch of auditing built into the software now, so you don't have to do as much of that on your own, save yourself some development time, and Microsoft just kind of baked all that stuff in there for you. So the SSIS deployment model in 2012 is actually, it seems like it's a lot easier to deploy packages out, and in practice I've found that it actually is much easier to promote things between different environments, and you don't have to worry about doing as much updating. Granted, you don't have a configuration table that you can just run the updates against, but with the invention of those project level connection managers and everything done at the project level, there's really, I found, a lot less to change between environments than there used to be. Okay, so we'll hop back over here just to kind of review. We used SSIS, as I said, to be able to bring in data from a bunch of different places. It's really built to bring in data from all kinds of different stuff. The control flow, as I mentioned, doesn't move data. It's just going to control what runs and when. That way we don't truncate tables before we end up loading them. And the data flow is going to be the apparatus that we use to actually move all of our data. So whether that's a flat file source, which didn't exactly work out in my favor today, or whether it's pulling data out of a SQL database, an Oracle database, whatever that might happen to be, your data flow is going to be the place to do that. Here's my contact information. I'm going to read through some of the questions that we have here in the question box and try to get to some of those while we're here together. If I don't get to your question, as I mentioned, Rachel will be able to get me a list of all the questions today, and I'll put them out on my blog. If you guys have questions on anything that I did cover as far as expanding upon it, feel free to shoot me an email. If you guys have questions on stuff that I didn't cover today, also, like I said, feel free to shoot me an email about that. And maybe what we can do in the future here is if we have a lot of questions on things I didn't get to cover today, we can see what's going on and see if maybe we can get another webinar out there at some point to go a little bit more in depth and not just talk about some of these differences between 2008 and 2012. So, as I said, though, a lot of the concepts that you guys know from the 2008 environment do carry over to the 2012, especially inside of your data flow. So if you've got experience with that, you're good to go on that side of things. So Rachel, did you have any particular questions that you wanted me to take a look at here, or
well, you have
to read through some of these? And
yeah, you have a plethora of questions. There is absolutely no way we could get through all of these. Brad is very popular, and he has, I would say, about 50 questions in here. So I say just pick the ones that you think you can get through the quickest.
All right. So we have one here that says, if package configuration is removed in 2012, how do we migrate packages from beta to stage to prod where potentially server name and connection strings are different? So I did show you guys a little bit of that. The question is essentially, how do I move the packages between dev, stage, and prod? As you saw in there, just once you get them deployed out, you can go in, just do the configure option. If you right-click on the packages and do configure, you can change all of your values inside of there at that point. So that's going to be your easiest way to do that. Edward asked, what type of projects did I select inside of Visual Studio inside the SSIS solution? It's the same option that you chose in 2008. It's just an integration services package, or an integration services project. I'll see if I can get you guys the URL for a couple of those webinars that I had mentioned that will expand upon some of those other topics. I see there's quite a few questions in here about which webinars I had referenced in there. So I will be sure to get you guys those. Let's see here. It says, is it possible to add a custom task created by developers using .NET into the toolbox so that they can be used across the enterprise? Yes, you can still add custom tasks. One of our products actually, and for Task Factory, plugs right into that. So I haven't seen any issues adding custom tasks into 2012. I've used a couple of other third-party tasks as well, so they all seem to integrate perfectly fine inside of there. Something I didn't mention that is pretty important is there's actually several different versions of SQL Server 2012. You still have your Developer Edition, which mimics enterprise features. You still have your Standard and your Enterprise editions, but you also have one that's called a BI edition. And one of the big things that you need to take a look at is there's actually an entire MSDN page that has a list of all the different editions and which tasks are included in each one of those. So not every single task is going to be included in every single version of SSIS. For instance, if you're doing change data capture, which I mentioned there's some tasks inside of SSIS now to do CDC with 2008 and 2012, which it does hook up to both of those. But those tasks I don't believe are actually, I know they're not available inside the Standard Edition, but I also don't believe that they're available inside the BI Edition. I think you actually do need to have an Enterprise Edition of SSIS in order to run those particular tasks. So make sure you check the MSDN page and keep that in mind whenever you start doing some of your development. Packages as well. So there's a couple of questions in here about how do I move packages, like if I just have one package that I want to give to somebody. You can still go out onto the file system and make copies of the SSIS packages and add them to other solutions, but there's no way to actually deploy a single SSIS package with the 2012 deployment model. You deploy the entire project or you don't deploy any other project. There isn't a concept of being able to pick and choose which packages you want. If you need to do that, my recommendation would be to create a separate solution for those packages you need to deploy individually, or that subset of packages that you have to deploy. How about creating a deployment package with a manifest file, essentially like you would do in 2008 R2? When I right-clicked, it's a really good question, Joseph. Whenever I right-clicked and did that deploy, essentially there is still a manifest type file in the background. I believe the extension on it is ISPack now instead of .manifest or SSIS deployment manifest, whatever that happened to be in the 2008 version. But if you go into whenever you build the project, whenever you go into the bin folder, just like you would go find your manifest file, there is a deployment file in there that you can use still. There's a question in here about what's the best practice to manage connection strings between prod and QA. like I said, the best way that I've found to do it is to just get the packages deployed out there, and then as soon as you deploy the packages, right-click and do configure, and go through and just go down the list and make sure all your connection strings are good, are pointing to the right environments in there. There may be some report that you could try to finagle together out of those SSIS tables in order to find out what the connection string is on each one of your packages. But the best way that I found to do it is just to go into that configure screen and do it inside of there. The 2012 deployment model does not have the file system option anymore. That is absolutely correct. There is no option to deploy to the file system if you're using the 2012 project deployment model. If you're creating packages in 2012, as I mentioned, you can still go back and do that switch the project over to the 2008 R2 version of the deployment. In that case, you're really deploying a 2008 package. You're not deploying a 2012 package. So if you are in the project mode, there is no option to deploy to file system. And we'll do one or two other quick ones here. It says, how is the SQL agent job handled in 2012? Can we do it to a project level? So you still need to create your master package. Like if you want to execute a bunch of different packages, you can either add a step for each one of those packages, or you can create one master package and have it execute all the other ones. Essentially, the same option is there inside of your job step. There's an integration services package step that you can add, and all you do is just like you would if you were deploying it out to MSDB, just give it the server name and then drill down into the list and find the package that you want to execute. You can also overwrite the connection strings and parameters at that point as well if you really wanted to. So great question, Samuel, but yes, you can execute that from an agent job. Is SSIS 2012 able to connect to the cloud, like application like sales.com? I know there's some good integration with Azure inside of 2012. I'm not 100% sure about some of the other third-party applications. If there's a task that happens to be in there, then like a third-party task to be able to connect to it, then absolutely you would be able to connect to those other places. And then finally, can we use the existing SSIS configuration files in 2012? Unfortunately, no, you cannot. I believe when you do the upgrade from 2008 to 2012, when you run it through that little wizard that we took a look at very briefly in there, I believe when you run through that wizard that it will try to create parameters out of those, but I'd have to run through that again and test. It's been quite a few months since I've done an upgrade from a 2008 project over to a 2012, but I can definitely try running through that at some point here in the future and get back to you on that. So as I mentioned, Rachel's going to give me a list of these questions here. I will try to get those up on my blog here at some point in the next couple of weeks and get those questions answered out there for you. So thank you guys for coming out today.